Hello everyone, and welcome to my cyberpunk dystopia. In the background you can see a faint image of my virtual cyber girlfriend, which I have purchased with my good points credits. I just want to talk about for a second how if you go on Google right now, there are so many articles that are defending the virtue of virtue signaling. And this point is an amazing evil. They are trying to defend this social capitalist game, the neoliberal left's inability to take on critique. And their argument basically is that any critique of virtue signaling is a virtue signal in itself. And this is something that you can see that both the pseudo-Marxist feminists that we're going to be talking about in my next critique, which is going to be the Chinese Marxist distortions that are used to prop up Chinese neoliberalism. Not said by me, I've said this in the past, but we're going to be looking at an amazing book called Neoliberal Psychology in order to be critiquing that. That is an amazing, that's even a better work than this, or on the same level as this one, these two works on critiquing neoliberal empire. The left's inability to take on the critique of the right wing issue of virtue signaling, their only ability to fight back is all of these neoliberal psychology articles talking about how it's necessary to have virtue signaling as a form of, for example, moral grandstanding or role modeling without actually doing the hard work. Really, we live in such dystopic times that this is actually the case, that there are people who unthinkingly, and how you know that this is truly insane is that it's bipartisan in the realm of the discipline of psychology, where both the left wing, the intersectional discourse that focuses, the American Psychological Association, that focuses and defends virtue signaling, aligns with evolutionary psychology, which is also defending virtue signaling argument, which is incredibly interesting. And I do want to do a video on that. Please give me some comments if you're interested in that. But today we're going to be talking about The Ruse of Repair, an amazing work. And, I finally found it. A feminist work that talks about complicity, that takes seriously the problems of incommensurability, that is associated with the bland neoliberal form of intersectionality, prescribed intersectionality. And she does it without ever using the word intersectionality, because unfortunately, we all have to play this social capital game within academia as well, that the only way to survive in academia today is without getting hounded by the thousands of unread, vicariously traumatized people. So she is in fact quite a skilled writer, and she does it within the feminist tradition of talking about lived experiences and with impeccable writing, much better writing than I can ever do. She masks her critique of the popular mores of the neoliberal left that I critique on my channel with poetic distinction. She's really good. And she does it without ever playing the power equals privilege game of seeing patriarchy at every turn. When she does refer to patriarchy, she's referring to actual patriarchy, which is the worship of the father, not this ubiquitous kind of patriarchy where all men are above all women. When she's using the word patriarchy, she's actually meaning the word, and she's referring to a situation that is actually patriarchal, which is quite refreshing. And she's really skilled, and she's well read, and she is arguing from within the tradition, and she masks her critique. So I'm going to be getting into that because she's not the only academic that is forced to mask their critique of rainbow washes over the problems of incommensurability and complicity, she does it very skillfully here. And she recognizes exactly what I talk about, the main thesis of her work, talking about how popular psychology idioms and notions of self-care fall neatly into the paradigms required by neoliberal subjectivity. Something that, if you take a look at my critique of Bell Hooks on love, Bell Hooks ultimately misses, and she's unable to see the real problems that go with this cognitive behavioral therapy, which Jungian, and actually being critical in our thoughts, right? So we have to actually kind of do a balance, because sometimes, and this is another critique that I have, is sometimes when you see oppression everywhere, it makes you paralyzed in a way, which in fact we kind of should be, because it is the post-apocalyptic world. We do have microplastics in our DNA. We do have chemicals like Teflon everywhere, and this is why I just appreciate the cyberpunk aesthetic so much. So let's get started. I'm just going to give you an abridged reading of this. Again, her thesis is talking about this problem of self-care, but in doing that, she's able to talk about the complicity that I talk about, and in terms of incomprehensibility, incommensurability between different factions on the left, the no longer existing left. So, the prison of critique. When Eve Sedgwick first formulated her call to revalue repair in the mid-1990s, she did so out of a sense that critique had become useless and outmoded tool to deal with state violence. Sedgwick argued that the time for the paranoid project of exposure of post-1960s new historicist, deconstructive, feminist, queer, and psychoanalytic criticism was over. Now, it's not over, especially the psychoanalytic, and that's what we need. In fact, we need to go back to the psychoanalytic, and there's plenty of writers that are doing that actually, but they're just not well known, and they're not well propagated, because that kind of work requires difficult thinking, right? And it doesn't go with the easiness of Instagram idioms that are actually destroying our communities, these Instagram idioms that she's going to be talking about. A lot of it has to do with self-care, a lot of it has to do with witches, a lot of it has to do with all of these idioms you've already heard. I don't need to repeat them again. This commodification and the moralization of commodification of emotional labor being the main one, the one that doesn't allow us to listen to one another because of the power equals privilege logic that makes feminists fight other feminists on the street and gives all the power to the privileged classes. And she does talk about this in this work, and I highly recommend that you take a look at it. The hermeneutics of suspicion that practiced the unveiling of practices that had been hidden or naturalized. Yar's piece above might be said to practice this mode of analysis in a visual key. We're ill-equipped to analyze violence that was from the beginning exemplary and spectacular. Such analytical tools had been much more suited to a time when violence was depreciated and hence hidden in the first place. Why bother exposing the ruses of power in a country where at any given moment 40% of young black men are enmeshed in the penal system, she asks. For Sedgwick, paranoid critique was not only passé, but mean and condescending too, in its willingness to dismiss pleasure, beauty, and the comfort of amelioration. And this critique, Sedgwick and her allies, and what she talks about in this work is how this sex positive feminist or selling sex feminism was just not comfortable in feminist spaces when it first started. The moralization of the commodification of emotional labor hadn't taken hold and hadn't allied itself with queer theory yet. It soon would do that because it is allied at the end of the day with the power of neoliberal analysis, the power that puts market at the center of our ability to distinguish right from wrong. how the aesthetics and the forms of post-war anti-colonial materialist liberation movements were partially displaced and partially recuperated by the late 20th century neoliberal rational capitalist imperial project. So that's what the Ruse of Repair is all about. It traces the rise of the reparative and how these kinds of idioms, how I describe them as idioms, have destroyed solidarity on the left and have replaced solidarity on the left with therapy culture, right? We don't need community, we need therapy. So again, this is an actual endorsement of her work, right? So she's going to be talking about so much in this work. It's actually a heart-pulling book, and I highly recommend it. 10 out of 10, 9.5 out of 10. A really good book of 2021. The first half of this book explores the reparative practices, visions, and aesthetics generated from within feminist and solidarity movement cultures around specific scenes in U.S. imperial history that facilitated neoliberal economic transformations. My friends, this is what I've been arguing on my channel, and I really hope that we can get out of this bullshit, all of this bullshit that we've been doing to ourselves. Through their reparative hermeneutics, their specific designs for drawing into relation conditions of structural violence across borders and time varied, as did their designations of the sites worthy of their reparative efforts and attention. Each of these scenes, movements, actors, and cultural workers practiced the love Sedgwick associates with Kleinian reparation. Now, I love the work of Klein. I love the work of Klein, and especially her idea of feeling or becoming or seeing from the Nazis' perspective. I think that a lot of Hannah Arendt's work does that as well. And I think that this work really challenges that idea that I have. I still, at the end of the day, think it's important to be able to see from the farthest reaches. There's no real answer. All I'm doing here is noting the neoliberal alliances that happen here. So, invested in visions of repair that might heal the violence wrought by the present and past of racism and imperialism, they attempted to reassemble the pieces of world riven by U.S. empire's voracious reach into something not quite like what came before, and something that might offer nourishment and comfort in the face of the turbulent present. Always be careful about nourishment and comfort. And what is the cost of this nourishment and comfort if you want to do a neoliberal cost-benefit analysis? As Zizek says, every cup of coffee that you buy to save the rainforest has its externalities within the cost of the coffee. Yet, whether this repair work was directed at the perceived unfun killjoy politics of the Iranian Revolution and anti-pornography feminism, now that's a really fun way of putting the killjoy idiom back in the face of feminist analyses. That's the real killjoy, anti-pornography feminism, or lost matrilineal black kinship bonds severed by slavery and empire, or genocide abetting U.S. intervention in Central America. Feminist and solidarity movements' visions of remediation for structures that hurt became entangled with and were often the site of the articulation of those emerging logics of privatization, communal downsizing, and the selective incorporation of racial difference and indigeneity that characterized the solidifying neoliberal regime. Often organized around the practice of the care of the self. And you can see Foucault does focus in his Birth of Biopolitics, he focuses on the care of the self as being one of the central components of this neoliberalism as well, of this neoliberal culture, this ideology as well. And you can see how that care of the self has really become central, self-care, to a lot of this kind of insanity. And, of course, I'm not saying, I went through a witch phase myself, okay? I went through a Jungian phase myself to deal with my trauma, and it was very helpful in many senses. But at the end of the day, to become a true psychologist, to become a true psychoanalytic person, you have to kill your idols at the end of the day. You always have to do Nietzsche's eternal return, right? You hold up these idols for a little while, you gain what you can from it, and then you go back to realizing that the desert is the real truth, right? Not even the market can answer the real existential questions, or especially the market, which is something that our culture just fails to realize. And in failing to realize this, we fail to create true rites of passage for our society, which I think is so central for coming up with a positive future, if there is ever going to be any. Of course, I've given up on the positive future. These works of complicity like Patricia Stuelke, these are the slight hints of hope that, oh look, there's like a couple of feminists there's a couple of race theorists that are looking out for complicity, that they see that prescribed intersectionality is a form of racism in itself, is a form of pedantry in itself. I'm always critiquing all of academia. There's so little, because there's so much publish or perish mentality within academia that it's just so difficult to swim through all the bullshit, right? And this is a real gem of a work, and I highly recommend that you read all of it. So, often organized around the practice of the care of the self, coupled with investments in hemispheric or transnational affiliation across difference, exercise of the reparative as a means of challenging U.S. imperialism, past and present, by activists and artists, often in effect, though not always by intention, cleaved anti-imperialist orientations from anti-capitalist commitments, such that challenging empire became a route to consisting and celebrating racial capitalist forms of intimacies. Isn't that exactly what I'm talking about on this channel? Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for this work. You're making me cry. This was in part because the US state was itself selling free trade liberalization and austerity through reparative gestures of its own, often similarly organized around appeals to shared histories of violence, premised on acknowledging colonial past, if not their ongoing presence, and fantasies of loving closeness with the citizens of Central America and the Caribbean, whom it planned to coerce or violently subdue into neo-colonial economic arrangements. Fuck you, Justin Trudeau. Okay, I'm sorry. Both the U.S. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. Any section I'm reading is vitally important, and it's an abridged version. U.S. imperialist, settler state, and solidarity movements generated fantasies of identification with subjects of U.S. imperialist violence in Central America and the Middle East that were organized around resonant notions of repair. Klein's theorization of the reparative was shaped as both Eng and Caroline Lobander explained, first in the debates over whether Germany should have to pay reparations after its World War I defeat, and then in World War II era of genocide and global war. We might describe Klein's theory of reparation, Eng writes, as an attempt to provide a new language for love and repair in order to rescue a besieged liberal human subject in the midst of utter destruction. You know, this is why I love Zizek so much compared to so many other academics. You know, when academics are completing their lecture for the day after they talk about all the terrible things and then they are forcefully have to go towards some optimism. Oh yes, you know, I spent this whole lecture talking about chemicals in our water or microplastics or all these terrible neoliberal things or all these terrible... this is why I liked Joy James as well. I spent the whole lecture talking about all this stuff, but I'm going to end on a good note. Let's end on a good note. No, let's just... And this is a psychoanalytic thing, right? Psychoanalysis versus this pop psychology. Psychoanalysis asks us to, hey, let's end on a good... I'm gonna end on a good note, ironically, after all this. Labender shows how these Kleinian logics of love, of trying to do good to their objects, to want to heal, repair, help, or cure them, that critics have come to celebrate through Sedgwick's uptake of Klein's theory, were thoroughly enmeshed in this broader cultural struggle over what might constitute justice, amends, and repair in a time of colonial violence, genocidal fascism, and war. Labender describes, for instance, how Klein's measures the improvement of her child patient Richard by his ability to sympathize with, to identify with, his destroyed enemy, which meant, in the context of the Second World War, his ability to see himself in the fascist, anti-Semitic empire of the Nazis. I think this is the problem I have with this. I'm not totally convinced of this. I think that there is a power in, you know, in that scene in World War I Christmas movie where, you know, the soldiers are going to no man's land and then they look into each other's eyes like, oh, this is your family, that's my girlfriend. Oh, look at that picture. You know, that's just an amazing thought. I think that you can't really see yourself within empire, but you can definitely see yourself within individuals. And one more thing in general about the idea of self-care and health is that through my own healing process, at some point I've realized that I've healed enough. I've dealt with the deepest traumas, my deepest traumas. And by healing enough, what do I mean? I mean that I came to a point where I'm able to distinguish what are my own burdens from the burdens of others. And no longer did I get that confused, like continuously vicarious traumatized people do, like the people who are so traumatized that they go into and try to become clinical psychologists, that go in, clinical psychologists, but yeah, really, clinical psychologists as well. They go into policy making and they, you know, make articles like 1 in every 4 women are raped, this kind of thing. That kind of vicarious traumatization is just so not helpful for our society. And when I healed, not only did I overcome my need for people like my witchiness, my Wiccan rituals. I still do a lot of rituals. I believe in the concept of rituals, but you know, I overcame. You know, you have to be able to challenge tradition too. And you go, witches aren't the oldest thing. There's even older things than that, and that's, I'm going to be doing videos about Indo-European religions, and those are really much older than these witches and pre-pagan cultures and all of these things, and it's super interesting. But the main thing I want to talk about now is how I realized that we don't need to always be healing. And this is something I agreed with in this work, and that's how I know that Patricia Stuelke is a very healed person. Everybody going through this healing process, at some point, they make an Instagram, right? I'm going to help people. You know, I did that too, right? I'm going to go out and help people. I'm going to make money from helping people. It's actually ingenious. That's why we live in a time of too many gurus. The reason we live in a time of too many gurus is because too many people haven't actually swallowed the difficult truth of the fact that truly healing is to wear your wound outside on your heart and just agree with the fact that sometimes healing just isn't possible. That doesn't mean you have to cut people off. The fact that you are cutting people off, if you read Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman, that's another amazing work that I highly recommend for all these vicariously traumatized people. Sorry about my words. It's hard to hear. And I'm not going to apologize because I'm Canadian and we apologize too much already. You have to wear your wounds on your sleeve at some point. And that's the only way to go forward. And once we all are able to wear our wounds on our sleeves, rather than cut people off, rather than trying to say that, you should shut up because you're oppressing me, you're not giving a trigger warning, blah, 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 microaggressions. There's a website for microaggressions, and they're just every little tactic that people see as being microaggressive. People don't realize that this whole thing is being fostered by your amygdala, and you going out and putting billboards like one in every 4 women are raped is making our society worse because it's making people's amygdalas fire off. And when you make people's amygdalas fire off, it's really crazy. This hysteria, in a way, is needed. But we need to come out of this hysteria as well. And the sooner we come out of this hysteria, the sooner we realize that our cyberpunk dystopia, these are the thoughts that this book is making me think, and this book is making me feel, and I hope that you take a look, right? And I love how when I go to therapy and I ask these difficult questions of whoever's my therapist, and there's no choice but for them to also be triggered, because these are hard philosophical questions, right? That psychologists aren't equipped for. They're equipped for the worst case scenarios. Psychologists are equipped for the worst case scenarios. And yes, you can find the worst case scenarios and you can heal the worst case scenarios, but you can't heal from, there's a ceiling of healing. And for this, I highly recommend that you look at my critique of bell hooks on love. In Laubender's account, this example emphasizes how for Klein, the power of the reparative lay in the child's ability to exculpate its own guilt by adjudicating injury and repair. Reparation names a process in which the child constructs the object's injury according to its own expectations and desires, its own ability to position itself as the agent of repair. And that's one of the critiques of this book, as there's a person who arbitrates whether this person is able to heal or not. And it's a difficult position, right? That's the cost-benefit analysis. Instead of seeing the other person as always, giving them endless benefit of the doubt, because you are endless, filled with love. Because we do this in our society, and we need money for those people who aren't able to do this, the people who aren't able to do this, they have to pay. They have to pay more. And if you can't heal, you have to pay more. You have to take more classes in this insane therapy culture that we've created. A therapy culture that is undermining community. Therapy culture undermines community. Prescriptive intersectionality undermines anti-racist and anti-sexist and anti-classist struggles. Ing elaborates on how this arbitration of injury and repair is structured by what he names the colonial object relations that lie at the heart of the consolidation of a European liberal human subject. At some point, you realize, as a post-colonial thinker, that, and I'm going to be doing a defense of post-colonialism, I'm going to be doing a defense of Spivak soon. Tomorrow is when this book releases that's attacking Spivak, and I'm going to be reading that book right away and defending Spivak right away because I've read all the other books about that. So at some point you realize that the academia that has trained you to heal, the academia that has trained you to become a decolonial thinker is itself entrenched within a colonizing and neoliberal empire, and it has basically no right to do this. And when you come to that point, you no longer go for your PhD. You don't need your PhD anymore. You go at reading by yourself and you realize this whole fucking thing is stupid. You should just carve out your own way. The reparative amounts then to a psychic process by which some objects are imagined as worthy of repair and others are not, is a deliberation that makes the continual inscription of the racial logics of the colonial and settler colonial world order and the designation of who counts as human or not the purview of the logic loving, creative, properly bounded liberal subject. And who are we really talking about here when we point our fingers and say, this person is irreparable? He's a toxic individual. They are toxic. They are unwilling to heal. This is what the next book that we're going to be talking about, here, I have it right here actually. Karl Ratner's Neoliberal Psychology. Next book we're going to be talking about. He talks about how Thatcher says this pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality, right? There's only so much that the neoliberal state can do for you, sir. At the end of the day, you have to deal with your own trauma. You have to go through your own Jungian individuation process. Thatcher does that. Thatcher is the beginning of it. Reagan Thatcher. Right? And we have absorbed this into the left by the moralization of the commodification of emotional labor. And yes, I do say that in those words because I want the people who created these words to be responsible for their complicity, for their continuation of neoliberalism, because that is the only way to realize that we cannot commodify emotional labor, that our love for one another cannot be commodified. Until we realize that, we will always be giving power to Jeff Bezos and company. In Klein's case studies of true reparation, Labender indicates the healing creativity of such subjects is deemed to manifest through a number of telling scenes, through a colonizer's fantasy of the repopulation of territory with colonizers after the elimination of indigenous peoples, through a scene of white women celebrated for painting a naked black woman, etc., etc. Eng and Labender's work thus reveals the reparative as a mode that links insufficient state visions for the resolution of unresolvable violences of the past, visions that so accompany new exercises and extensions of racial capitalist power with the fraught identificatory impulses that underlie solidarity projects. During the transition to neoliberalism, both the U.S. imperialist state and U.S. feminist and anti-imperialist solidarity movements shared the political and psychic unconscious of colonial object relations. You see, I'm not the only one that's noticing this. Anybody who has a deep heart, who's healed, anybody who's well-read notices these things. But unfortunately, as Zizek's debate with Jordan Peterson highlighting that we live in a meritocracy, a lobster-based meritocracy, and Zizek gives his devastating critique of Peterson by saying, if we were in a meritocracy, I wouldn't be debating you. And sent Peterson back to the desert of his addiction. That was a key moment, and that moment was cut out from the YouTube debate, because the YouTube debaters, the people who filmed that thing, were Jordan Peterson fans. They cut that out. I'm also a Peterson student, by the way, as am I a Zizek student. So, during the transition to neoliberalism, both the U.S. imperialist state and U.S. feminist and anti-imperialist solidarity movements shared the political and psychic unconscious of colonial object relations that Eng diagnoses as constitutive of the reparative, participating in the recycled and ongoing practice of drawing lines around which objects are constituted as good and worthy of reparations, but psychically constituted as human. Lines informed by the racial, capitalist, and colonial past and present. For feminist and solidarity writers and activists, their invention of reparative visions of solidarity directed at repairing the violence of U.S. empire often further resembled the therapeutic journey of Klein's patients, who, similarly, as Lobander describes, constructed the object's injury according to their own expectations and desires, their own ability to position themselves as the agents of repair. A process that offered the feeling of ethical action. Such reparative visions, and that the feeling that justified them, the first half of this book suggests, became conduits through which neoliberal racial capitalist forms of desire, debt, and recognition began to take shape. Because the reparative in all its layers, psychic processes, social form, interpretive hermeneutic, is relentlessly invested in identification with a damaged object, activists and cultural workers' reparative investments often emerge in these chapters as the aftermath and reprise of the sentimental, or what Berlant has named its unfinished business. Berlant cautions that for Sedgwick, reparative reading was never meant to be a sentimental exercise, as Sedgwick viewed sentimentality as tendency towards foreclosure and homogenized attunement. Homogenized towards what? This neoliberal subjectivity. This is why proponents of reparative reading tend to emphasize that Sedgwick's vision of reparation is not the same as an indiscriminate restoration of the past or an uncritical relation to violent histories. Its failure to be revolutionary and the violence of its humanizing gestures given that in the realm of sentimentality, the ethical imperative towards social transformation is replaced by a passive and vaguely civic-minded ideal of compassion. In fact, it's taken over completely by neoliberal cost-benefit analysis. The political, as a place of acts-oriented publicness, becomes replaced by a world of private thoughts, leanings, and gestures. And now, here is where we get complicated within what neoliberalism means. The complication here is that the public, meaning the state, is the one that is invading the private in order to replace ideas of the public, in this time the commons, with ideas of the private. AKA neoliberalism requires the state. So neoliberalism requires the state to inflict neoliberal subjectivity onto people and create and move everyone more and more into the private and privatize. That's what privatization means. Privatization means about privatization of your thought. The personal is political. It doesn't make anything political. All it does is help the invasion of the political into the personal in order to privatize further. Right? This is why I point my fingers in this direction of intersectionality as being problematic. Intersectionality without complicity, intersectionality without incommensurability is rainbow washing, is the most intense form of greenwashing. It's the utmost form of neoliberal colonialism of the mind. The gesture of imagining that feeling with and feeling right constitutes a form of political action, even if it goes no further than a change of heart. What it produces then is not unlike that feeling of ethical action, that is not necessarily ethical at all, that Laubinder identifies as central to the reparative mode. So the personal is political. Not only are you privatizing, but you are convincing yourself that this is a political act. It's what ingenious mode of participation is this? You capitalize to the utmost and you say it's a revolutionary act. Oh. Okay, so its emphasis on private feeling, its power and privilege to define how and when the suffering objects of solidarity constitute recognizable humans, its commitment to what Berlant calls bargaining with what there is. When you give up the imagination, my cyberpunk, I've never given up on my imagination. I just think that we need to be within what is, but we don't bargain with what is. We keep our imagination. That's what cyberpunk is all about. My philosophy of cyberpunkism. It's a defeatist way. This sex positive, sex for sale feminism is a defeatist way of moving forward. And Patricia does point her fingers at that as well. Activists and cultural workers' reparative projects and modes emerged from the recognizable place that Sedgwick identifies as the Kleinian depressive position, which she describes as an anxiety mitigating achievement, one that comes to encompass, for example, both the preconditions of severe depression and also quite a varied range of resources for surviving, repairing, and moving beyond that depression. In the context of Sedgwick's political world and the larger movement and scholarly scenes with which it intersects, the depressive position offers a way of conceptualizing a particular mood of political fatigue, often laced with guilt and individual but also communal frustration with the ongoing task of critiquing structural violence that doesn't seem to change, that seeds the reparative turn. From spaces of both emergency and exhaustion. This is why I always call it vicarious traumatization. Yeah, we're all tired. It's too much emotional labor. Motivated by a desire to be absolved or obtain relief. There is no relief. Stay. This is a psychoanalytic wisdom quote, is to stay with, feel the negative. Feel the fact that there's microplastics in our water. Feel the fact that we live in a post-apocalypse where there's chemicals everywhere. Truly feel it. There is no cognitive behavioral therapy here. Yes, cognitive behavioral therapy is helpful in your everyday life, but it shouldn't be your ideology. Activists and cultural workers turn to dreams of compassionate connection and the reparative reconstitution of intimacy, family, and community across borders and racial class divides. Capitalist and state projects of multicultural inclusion that sacrifice indigenous sovereignty, even as those forms of intimacy and connection come to substitute for or be imagined as the happy achievement of broader structural change. But these chapters also attend to how these reparative visions and hermeneutics gained currency as the social movements with which they were associated became institutionalized and social movement infrastructures, what Berlant calls those patterns, habits, norms, and scenes of assemblage and use that characterize the life of a social movement, hardened into institutional wisdom and practice. What these accounts indicates is the sentimental reparativity of sex radical feminism, despite its varying and complex relationships to racialized femininity and heterosexuality. So here is a point in which intersectionality is actually challenged for once. But she never uses the word intersectionality throughout this whole paper. There's a lot of kinks between what are supposed to be allies, washed over with this word intersectionality. So, sex radical feminists see the world as an affective space where people ought to be legitimated because they have feelings and there is an intelligence to what they feel that knows something about the world that, if it were listened to, could make things better. In their principled defense of their erotic competencies, these memoirs refuse to deny the classed, raced scenes of desire's production, but nonetheless assert desire as unimpeachable. Desire was to be openly acted upon without analysis. In my feminist training, one of the things that they always taught male feminists was to be aware of what is impacting your desire. So many of these hypocrisies exist in the feminist movement, depending on what kind of identity markers that you have. And here we get to some really interesting forms of collusion. Allison remembers the sex wars as a period of betrayal. The women's movement was not a safe space we had imagined it to be. Open discussion was not the rule as we had imagined. And not only would these people take over the feminist movement, they would, in fact, cut down on this idea of open discussion that they talk about. A lot of us had to hold back, hold ourselves up, and think very seriously about what we've been doing. For Allison, this dynamic of holding back and holding up characterizes her difficulty as a working class woman discussing her sexual preferences and practices amid middle class women's intent on pursuing an anti-pornography agenda. She describes feeling compelled to lead a compartmentalized life. She would slip out secretly from her collective house to date butch women her housemates thought were retrograde and sexist, until she decided that sexuality is the place where you cannot compromise. And this is why all the privileged people have all the power today. Allison's disappointment and the lack of open discussion among feminists commingles, however, with her own ambivalence about what open discussion might mean. Thank you, Patricia. Her unabashed longing for a safe place to affirm her desire without question or critique. Allison describes an old-fashioned consciousness-raising group that began by asking what it would be like to organize for our sexual desire as strongly as we tried to organize for our sexual defense. We wanted to talk truth about sex, Allison writes, wanted to understand without fear of censure, and most of all, we wanted to know that our lives were neither a betrayal of our beliefs nor a collusion with all we had fought for to change in this society. Yes, it fucking is collusion. And Patricia says, this is a remarkable statement upon which to build queer feminist radical praxis, much less a politics of solidarity from the heart of US neoliberal capitalist empire. It reveals a collective feeling of guilt over potential complicity with settler colonial racial heteropatriarchal capitalism, but also how the desire to disavow the guilt, to be assured unconditionally and in advance of not being in collusion with harmful systems, emerges as a progressive political position. They take the most regressive position and they make it into a progressive political position. Just like how the Vichy feminists are being defended today. If you go and search Vichy feminism or pictures of women who were accused of sleeping with Nazis, you'll find plenty of articles that defend the women's actions rather than giving them agency and responsibility to make the right choices in their lives. Just like how we defend in this very same racist tone, this power equals privilege rhetoric that maintains the noble savage narrative. Oh, these people were in a submissive position and they could never revolt against their situation. Wasn't that the whole fucking premise for the Eichmann trials. Here, and this is again why Hannah Arendt would never be a feminist. Not this kind of feminist. Or never called herself a feminist. And this is again why there are so many articles attacking Hannah Arendt. Because Hannah Arendt is the only one that is actually standing up for equality by talking about how we are all responsible, how we all need to be aware of our actions that socially reproduce the most oppressive situations and give all the power to privileged people. Here, the colonial politics of Kleinian reparation return in sex radical feminism's determination per ing to practice a care of the self disassociated from its violent colonial past. Allison, Nessel, and Moraga's determination to repair a feminism they see as damaged by anti-pornography feminism's threat to pleasure and innocence of desire rationalizes their participation in their settler colonial racial capitalism they otherwise reject as murderous. In this way, as sex radical reparation becomes codified as a radical political horizon, it morphed into an alibi for racial capitalist realism. And I love Patricia for focusing on that. This is a racial capitalism, not just capitalist realism. Sex radical feminism's insistence on desire's ungovernability began to function as a defense of the structures that continue to make desire legible, the hierarchies of intimacy inscribed by unequal labor relations of neoliberal racial capitalism become the horizon of the erotic. Notice how she does use heteropatriarchy sometimes, but again, Patricia is much more careful with her pointing out racism and patriarchy wherever. As is true for Jordan in her essay, at stake for the Secretary of Defense is her own pleasure and safety, as well as that of other black women. As you can see, the Department of Defense has a very good track record of equal opportunity for our women. But the price of this safety, as Erica Edward writes, is greater and greater intimacy with the very political order that threatened black communities at home and abroad. The poem ends with the image of the homegirl secretary swimming towards safety through a lake of her own blood. We could look at Cedric Robinson. I'm going to read this whole thing because this is also very beautiful, although this work does use a lot of these idioms. Power dressed up in a green suit against brown skin is the aesthetic object lesson of contemporary power. It beautifully represents the synthesis of global Cold War regime of security, the incorporation of peoples of color into the apparatus of Western governing, the myth of leadership. This is the very synthesis that Robinson so astutely presages in terms. It's not that great of a work, honestly. I don't recommend this one. Here too, Audre Lorde writes of what those soldiers invading Grenada and the Philippines under the watch of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Equal Opportunity and Safety are wiping out with their M16s, water pipes, cocoa pods, stalks of almost ripe banana, reading lessons in the brilliant afternoons, sister, tree, Granny Lou, baby, father, flesh. So, as the Assistant Secretary promises the extension of protection to those minority groups, minority citizens formally denied such protections. As you can see, the department has a very good record of equal opportunity for our women. She swims towards safety through a lake of her own blood. Like terms, Audre Lorde's equal opportunity indicates the violence that secures order and turns towards the safety of what Robinson calls the alternative authorities. If political order is something that we think we need or we think we should naturally, rightly, structurally human relationships, we might accept that the state has the exclusive right to the use of violence, and that the state can determine when violence is lawful, aka carceral feminism. But if we agree that human relationships exceed order, and that in fact they flourish best when given over to naturally disorderly things, the natural world, body, the ancestors, the experimental, then violence doesn't rightly belong to anyone. M16s aren't any more necessary or natural than is order itself. I think this work is the preface of this work is really amazing. It reminds me of 2 points. The first is, again, how Bell Hooks' definition of love is this amygdalic need to securitize a definition, to bring order into the disorderliness of love. And number 2, Hannah Arendt's critique of the Jewish rabbis who did all of the paperwork for the Nazis, all of the lists. Okay, we're going to go in the train, everybody line up, this way we'll be safe. That's what talking about complicity is all about. And that is what is unable to be talked about within these people that spew intersectional idioms, prescribed intersectional idioms in our academia, that create Kerry Bourissas, that create sociopaths that take over our institutions. So this is another work by Erica Edwards. I argue that black women's sexuality functions at once as a lubricant for neoliberal governmentality and as a domain of collective preservation within this order. So it's another work that talks about complicity, but it's just still rooted within these where it doesn't go all the way, this work. It's good, but it doesn't go all the way. I'm on the lookout for feminist works on complicity and incommensurability. True critique. It's hard to find. If state narratives of black freedom making fueled the stories of American democracy and empire in the decades after World War II, representations of black women's sexuality in American public culture have surfaced over the same decades to announce the incorporation of black subjects as both practitioners and objects into the governing apparatuses of an increasingly global security state. These collusions and collisions take the form of irresistible fictions of black women's empowerment. This is the problem, right? She calls it a collision. These collisions and collusions, when it's just collusion. It's just collusion. There's no collision. It's just collusion. Okay? That's the power of neoliberalism. It takes collision and turns it into collusion. And that's why you need to be hyper vigilant. And unfortunately, the left is unable to be hyper vigilant because they have canceled critique. And lastly, the last line I'm going to point here, neoliberal multiculturalism that proceeds through the incorporation of racial, gender, and sexual minorities. But the price of safety, as Erica Edwards writes, is greater and greater intimacy with the very political order. Sometimes the will to repair helps instantiate something worse. Our good intentions have, as I have said before, led the way to hell. And the only person, the one that we have canceled, the only archetype that can allow us to go back to the gates of heaven is, guess who? Is the devil's advocate. The devil's advocate, me. I'm the devil's advocate in this position. You think it's easy for me to talk about this stuff? No, it's difficult. But that's how we can get into actual community. That's how we can repair community. That's how we can do actual ancestral reverence. That is how we can do, what does complicity mean? It means that your great 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 grandfather was the slave master. It's difficult to talk about. Was the guy who put everybody on the boats and raped your great 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 grandmother. It's a difficult thing to talk about. That's the hard work of complicity here. Complicity means that your sexuality, as this book talks about, is implicated. Who you choose to be with. You choose to be with the person who exploits surplus capital en masse. And that's basically the conclusion that many males have come to, is that because of the commodification of the moralizing, not the commodification, but even worse, the moralization of the commodification of emotional labor. There was always commodification, but there was always a chance for us to build a relationship. What's that song? Fell in love in a hopeless place. There's always a possibility to fall in love in a hopeless place. But because of the moralization of the commodification of emotional labor through the institutions of academia, psychology, and feminism's personalism, political as a whole, which we've talked about here, the obvious conclusion is that you need to exploit mass surplus labor, and then in your personal relationships, you will never have any problem with people complaining about something being too much emotional labor. I hope this work was such a great hope, and I hope you join me on the next work, an equally as amazing work with Karl Ratner's neoliberal psychology. Thank you so much.